The room was drenched in an unsettling stillness. Michael Williams' eyes fluttered open, greeted by the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room. The hum of machines and the faint rhythm of his heartbeat echoed in his ears. Confusion washed over him as he blinked repeatedly, trying to piece together the fragments of his reality. The world felt foreign. His body, stiff and weak, seemed alien to him, as if it had aged a decade overnight. His head throbbed as he struggled to move his fingers, to feel the coolness of the sheets beneath him. Everything felt distant, like he was floating between consciousness and a dream he couldn't quite shake off. He tried to sit up, but his muscles rebelled, forcing him back onto the bed. Panic surged through his chest. How did I get here? His mind raced, but there were no answers, just a hollow void where his memory should be. He blinked again, forcing his vision to focus on the room around him. The walls were pale, empty, offering no clues. No family photos. No familiar faces. As he turned his head, a figure caught his attention. Sitting by the window, her back slightly hunched, was a woman. She wore a pale blue nurse's uniform, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her face held a quiet sadness that she tried to hide behind her calm expression. She noticed his movement and stood quickly, crossing the room to his bedside. Her shoes barely made a sound on the tiled floor. "Mr. Williams?" Her voice was soft, careful, as if afraid of startling him. "Can you hear me?" Michael opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. It had been so long since he'd spoken. He could feel it. His throat was dry, and his voice came out hoarse. Where am I?" "You're at St. Andrew's Hospital," she replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You've been here for quite some time." He frowned, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "How long?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with an emotion Michael couldn't quite place. 6 months, she finally said. "You've been in a coma." 6 months. The words echoed in his mind, impossible to process. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of it, but nothing fit. 6 months of his life gone. Just like that. He didn't remember the accident that must have put him here. He didn't remember any of it. The nurse must have sensed the turmoil in his eyes because she pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down. "I'm Grace," she introduced herself. "I've been your primary nurse since you were admitted." Michael stared at her, trying to understand what kind of connection he was supposed to feel. Grace. Her name was unfamiliar. Yet there was something in her demeanor that made him feel safe. No. He shook the thought away. She was a stranger. Why was I in a coma? His voice sounded more desperate than he intended, but he needed answers. She glanced down at her hands, twisting them together before meeting his gaze. "You had a stroke, a severe one. The doctors didn't know if you'd wake up." Her eyes softened, the sadness returning to them. "But you did." Michael absorbed her words, the weight of them settling heavily in his chest. A stroke? He had been perfectly healthy, or so he thought. 6 months ago, his life had been all about his business, meetings, and projects. Everything was a blur now. Grace's voice cut through his thoughts. "Your body's been through a lot, and it will take time to recover. But I'll be here to help." He couldn't help but notice the sincerity in her tone. She wasn't just saying it out of duty. There was something more behind her words, something deeper. But he was too tired, too overwhelmed to analyze it. He leaned back against the pillows, exhaustion pulling at him. "Thank you," he muttered, unsure of what else to say. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had needed anyone's help. Grace nodded, standing up slowly. "I'll give you some time to rest. If you need anything, just press the call button." Michael nodded faintly, his mind already slipping back into the haze of fatigue. As Grace walked toward the door, he watched her, a feeling of familiarity tugging at the edges of his consciousness. It was as if he had known her before, but that was impossible. She was just a nurse, someone who had been assigned to his care during his coma. Yet, something about her presence lingered in his thoughts. He closed his eyes, the weight of the last few minutes crashing down on him. 6 months. How could his life have been reduced to nothing in such a short time? Who had been running his company? Had anyone missed him? A swirl of questions churned in his mind, but no answers came. only the steady beep of the machines and the echo of Grace's soft voice. Michael drifted back into the shallow comfort of sleep, but even there, the sense of unease remained. Something was wrong, something more than just the lost time and the coma. But for now, he was too weak to fight it. He would have to wait until his strength returned, until he could unravel the mystery that surrounded his sudden fall from the world. As his breathing slowed, Grace stood outside the door, her eyes lingering on him through the glass. She had been waiting for this moment for months, waiting for him to wake up. But what she had to tell him would change everything, and she wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it yet. Michael woke again, not knowing how long he had slept this time. His body still ached with weakness, his limbs heavy and uncooperative. The sunlight had shifted in the room, streaming through the window and casting soft, warm shadows across the floor. It should have felt comforting, but instead, it only deepened the strange emptiness that lingered inside him. He blinked, trying to clear his foggy mind. His thoughts drifted back to Grace, the nurse who had been by his side when he awoke. Her soft voice echoed in his head, the gentle reassurance she had offered when everything felt so disorienting. 6 months. 6 months of his life erased as though they had never existed. And the only person who had been with him during that time was her, a stranger. His mind fumbled through the fragments of his old life, trying to grasp onto something familiar. Who had I been? What had I left behind? Faces blurred in his memory, and the events leading up to his coma felt distant, like watching an old film with parts missing. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and before he could respond, it creaked open. Grace stepped in, carrying a tray with what appeared to be a simple meal: soup, crackers, and water. She gave him a brief smile as she placed it on the bedside table. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice light, though he could hear a deeper tension beneath it. "It'll help build your strength." Michael gave a small nod, but he wasn't focused on the food. He wanted answers. He needed them. Every piece of his life felt scattered like a puzzle that he couldn't begin to put together. "Grace," he began, his voice raspier than before. Before the coma, he paused, realizing he didn't even know what he was asking. His memories were jumbled. All he had were pieces. Grace's expression softened as she sat down on the chair beside him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I know it's confusing," she said gently, "but it'll come back, bit by bit. You were a very busy man, Mr. Williams. You ran a successful tech company, Williams Innovations." That name rang a distant bell in his mind. His company. He could vaguely recall the long hours, the endless meetings, and the high stakes of every decision. He had spent years building that empire from the ground up, sacrificing almost everything to see it thrive. But that's all it was: blurry fragments of boardrooms, deals, and the constant hum of pressure. Who's running it now? His brow furrowed as he tried to imagine someone else at the helm of his company, making decisions in his absence. Grace hesitated, and for the first time since he had awakened, she seemed uncertain. "From what I know," she began carefully, "your partner, David Young, has been handling things, at least until now." Michael's chest tightened at the mention of David, his business partner, the man he had trusted for years, but someone he always suspected had ambitions beyond what he admitted. Michael's mind raced with questions he didn't yet have the strength to voice. Had David taken over completely? Was his company still his? Grace's eyes were on him, watching the tension build in his expression. "I've kept track of the news," she said softly, "but you should probably speak to David yourself. I'm sure he'll want to see you now that you're awake." Michael wasn't ready for that conversation yet. There was too much he still didn't know, too much he couldn't remember. He shifted uncomfortably in the bed, the weakness of his body frustrating him. Grace, sensing his unease, offered a change of pace. "I've kept some of your personal belongings here," she said, standing up and moving to the corner of the room. "Your wallet, your watch, a few other things." She opened a small drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal, something that seemed oddly familiar, yet distant. She handed it to him, and as soon as his fingers touched the worn leather, a flicker of memory sparked. He had kept this journal close to him for years. It wasn't for business, but for personal thoughts, ideas, and reflections. He opened it, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. His handwriting scrawled across the paper, some entries clean and concise, others messy, as though written in haste or frustration. As he skimmed through, one particular entry caught his eye, and his heart skipped a beat. "I never told her. I should have told her years ago. Now it's too late. The guilt is suffocating." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Who was he talking about? What guilt? The edges of his memory trembled, as if something important was just out of reach. He turned the page, but it was blank, the journal abruptly ending there. His pulse quickened, anxiety building in his chest. There was something he wasn't remembering, something crucial. He turned to Grace, his voice sharp with urgency. "What happened before? Right before the coma?" "I can't remember." Grace's expression faltered, and for a moment, she looked like she was debating something internally, struggling with whether to tell him. But instead, she answered cautiously, "You had been under a lot of stress. Your health was suffering. That's all I know." Michael's frustration mounted. It wasn't enough. The journal entry had unlocked something. He could feel it. But he was still trapped in the dark, and Grace wasn't giving him the answers he needed. "I need to know more," he pressed, his tone firmer. "There's something I'm missing." Grace's eyes flickered with something. Pain, maybe? It was subtle, but it was there. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, swallowing whatever words had almost escaped. "I promise," she said quietly, "everything will make sense soon. You're still healing. One step at a time." Her words were meant to soothe, but they only deepened the tension in his chest. There was more to this than just his health, more than just the stroke. Michael could feel it in the air between them, in the way Grace looked at him with a mix of concern and something deeper, something unsaid. He nodded, though it was far from an agreement. His body might be weak, but his mind was growing sharper with each passing minute. He needed to remember. And whatever Grace wasn't telling him, he was going to find out. As Grace left the room, Michael stared down at the journal, his fingers tracing the edges of the page. There was a mystery buried in his past, and he was going to uncover it, even if it shattered everything he thought he knew. The next few days passed in a blur for Michael. His body was slowly regaining strength, but the exhaustion remained heavy, clinging to him like a second skin. His mind, however, was restless. The journal had ignited a fire within him, fueling his need to remember the truth about his life before the coma. But no matter how hard he tried to pull at the threads of his memory, everything remained tangled in confusion. Grace was always there, a quiet presence in the room. She had a routine, checking his vitals, bringing him food, and offering comforting words when his frustration spilled over. Michael found himself watching her closely, trying to figure out why her presence felt so significant. There was something about her that he couldn't place. It wasn't just that she had been the one to care for him during the coma. There was a familiarity about her, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. One afternoon, as Grace adjusted his fore, Michael broke the silence that had settled between them. "Why did you stay?" His voice was low but firm, his eyes fixed on her as she worked. "You could have been assigned to other patients. I don't understand why you stayed with me all this time." Grace paused, her fingers lingering over the fore tube for just a moment before she met his gaze. Her expression remained composed, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something she quickly hid behind her calm demeanor. "I stayed because it was my job," she said, but even as the words left her lips, Michael could tell there was more to it. "You needed care, and I was assigned to you." Michael studied her, searching her face for answers. Her response was rehearsed, polite. He leaned back into his pillows, feeling the weight of the growing mystery settle deeper into his chest. It wasn't like him to leave things unexplained, especially when it came to something as strange as this. "I find that hard to believe," he said, his tone soft but pointed. "You don't seem like the type to just follow orders for the sake of it." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a brief second, her composure wavered. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she busied herself with rearranging the tray beside his bed, avoiding his gaze. Michael's frustration mounted. He wasn't used to being kept in the dark, especially not by someone like Grace. someone who clearly knew more than she was letting on. There was a connection between them, one that went beyond nurse and patient, but she wasn't ready to reveal what it was. Not yet. The silence stretched between them until Grace finally sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. She turned to face him, her expression softer, less guarded. "Michael," she said, her voice quieter than before, almost as if she was letting down a wall. "I stayed because it felt like the right thing to do." "You," she stopped herself, glancing down at her hands before continuing. "You didn't have anyone else?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. No one else. No one had come to see him. No friends. No family. No one had waited for him to wake up. "That can't be true," Michael said, shaking his head. "I have business partners, people who—" "They came at first," Grace interrupted gently. "Your partner, David, visited a few times. But as the weeks passed, they stopped coming. Everyone assumed," she trailed off, not finishing the thought, but Michael understood. They had assumed he wouldn't wake up. They had moved on without him. The cold truth sank in, chilling him to the bone. He had always been a man who valued control over his life, his company, his future. But now, lying in this hospital bed, he realized how little control he had. The people he thought would be there for him had given up. And yet, Grace, a woman who was practically a stranger, had stayed. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Grace hesitated, her eyes flickering with something deeper, something that Michael couldn't quite read. She looked at him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken, and for a moment, he thought she was about to reveal something important. But then she straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I stayed because it was the right thing to do," she repeated, her tone firmer now, as if shutting down the conversation. Michael wanted to push further, to ask the questions burning in his mind, but he could sense she wasn't ready. The invisible bond between them was there, but fragile, like a thread that could snap if he pulled too hard. He let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, though he wasn't satisfied with her answer. As the days passed, the tension between Michael and Grace grew, the unspoken connection hanging in the air between them like a storm waiting to break. He knew she was hiding something, and as much as he wanted to believe that it was nothing more than her being overly dedicated to her job, his instincts told him otherwise. She knew more about him, about his past, than she was letting on. One night, after Grace had left for the evening, Michael lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought back to the journal, the cryptic entry about guilt, the mention of someone he should have told something important. It had to be connected to Grace. The way she looked at him sometimes, with an emotion she tried so hard to hide, made him certain of it. He needed to know what it was. But more than that, he needed to understand why he couldn't shake the feeling that Grace wasn't just his nurse, that she was someone far more significant. But no matter how hard he tried, the memories remained elusive, like shadows slipping through his fingers. The only thing he knew for sure was that his life before the coma had been complicated. More complicated than he had ever imagined. And Grace Thompson held the key to unlocking the truth. He just didn't know how long he could wait for her to reveal it. As the night deepened, Michael drifted into a restless sleep, his mind filled with half-formed memories and unanswered questions. But one thing was certain. The bond between him and Grace was real, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down around them both. The sound of rain tapping against the window pane pulled Michael from another restless sleep. His mind had been churning in circles for days now, piecing together fragments of his past like a jigsaw puzzle that refused to come together. Each time he thought he was close, the pieces would slip away, leaving him more confused than before. But there was one constant in this sea of uncertainty: Grace. She was always there, and her presence lingered in his thoughts like an unsolved riddle. This morning, though, something felt different. His body felt lighter, less weighed down by fatigue. For the first time in weeks, he had the energy to sit up in bed without help. But as he moved, a sharp pain shot through his temple, followed by a rush of memories, disjointed, blurry, and incomplete. But there, he closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of the sudden flood. It was as though his mind had opened a door it wasn't ready to step through. flashes of meetings, faces he vaguely recognized, and the constant hum of his life before the coma flickered through his brain. But it wasn't just business. There was something personal, someone personal, buried in those fragments. A knock at the door brought him back to the present, and Grace walked in with her usual quiet demeanor. She was holding a tray, the smell of coffee and toast filling the air. "You're looking better today," she said softly, setting the tray down on the bedside table. Her voice was steady, but her eyes watched him closely, as if she was gauging how much progress he'd made. Michael nodded, still trying to sort through the lingering echoes of his memories. He wasn't ready to share what he'd remembered, not yet, not until he understood it himself. As Grace went about her usual routine, checking his vitals, adjusting the monitors, Michael decided it was time to push harder for answers. He couldn't sit in the dark any longer. The feeling that Grace held the key to the missing pieces was growing stronger by the day, and he needed to know what she wasn't telling him. "Grace," he said, his voice firm but not confrontational, "I remember bits and pieces. Things are starting to come back to me." Her hand paused over the monitor she was adjusting, but she didn't turn to face him immediately. There was a tension in the air, as if she had been waiting for this moment but was still unprepared for it. "I figured they would," she replied after a moment, keeping her tone even. "It was only a matter of time." Michael watched her carefully, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly as she continued her work. She was nervous, and if Grace was nervous, that meant there was more to this than he had initially thought. "I remember feeling guilt," he said, his voice slower now, as if testing the waters. "Something about a promise I didn't keep. But it's all still so hazy." Grace's shoulders tensed, and this time, she turned to face him fully. There was a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Something deep, something raw. She opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated, as if the weight of what she was about to say could change everything. "You don't need to worry about that right now," she said softly, but there was a tremor in her voice. "You need to focus on healing. The rest will come with time." Michael narrowed his eyes, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "No, I can't just sit here and wait. There's something you're not telling me, Grace. I can feel it." For a long moment, they stared at each other, the unspoken tension between them growing heavier by the second. Grace's eyes darted away, and she bit her lower lip, clearly torn between wanting to protect him and knowing that the truth was inevitable. "I've told you everything you need to know right now," she said, her voice a little firmer this time, though Michael could see the cracks in her resolve. "You were under a lot of pressure before the coma. Stress, health issues." "That's not what this is about," Michael interrupted, his voice rising with impatience. "This is personal. I know it, and I know it has to do with you." Grace's face paled, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her usual calm composure was slipping, and Michael could see the weight of whatever secret she was carrying was becoming too much for her to bear. "Why are you here, Grace?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with both curiosity and a growing sense of dread. "Really?" Her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, maybe even guilt. She took a step back, as if distancing herself from the inevitable confrontation. She began, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time since he had woken up, Grace seemed unsure, vulnerable. Michael leaned forward, sensing that she was on the edge of a confession. "Tell me the truth." Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she fidgeted with the cuff of her uniform. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally, she met his gaze again. "I stayed because," she stopped, took a deep breath, and then said, "Because there's more to this than you know, Michael. More than just your coma. More than just me being your nurse." The room seemed to close in around them as the weight of her words settled in the air. Michael's pulse quickened. He had known it all along. There was something deeper, something personal between them, but hearing her say it out loud felt like a door opening to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready for. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Grace swallowed hard, her expression filled with regret. "I can't tell you everything right now. Not yet. But there's something you need to understand." She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, and for the first time since they had met, there was no professional distance between them. There was only the raw, unfiltered truth struggling to break free. "You're not alone, Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "You never were. And I've been connected to your life for longer than you realize." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, a cold realization creeping into his veins. There was no turning back from this moment. Whatever Grace was hiding, whatever secret she had been carrying for months, was about to change everything. But before he could press her further, before he could ask the questions burning in his mind, the door to his room swung open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was David Young. The sudden intrusion shattered the fragile moment between him and Grace, and Michael's focus shifted immediately. David, his business partner, stood in the doorway, a forced smile on his face, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Michael. "Well, look who's finally awake," David said, his voice loud and full of false cheer. "I was beginning to think I'd have to take over for good." Michael's mind raced. The storm he had felt brewing was finally upon him. But with David's arrival, the questions about his company and the secrets Grace held were about to collide. And Michael was no longer sure which one was the greater threat. The atmosphere in the room shifted as David Young stood in the doorway, his broad figure casting a shadow over Michael's hospital bed. Michael's heart was still pounding from the revelation Grace had been on the verge of confessing, but the sudden presence of his business partner forced him to pull his thoughts in another direction. Whatever Grace had to tell him, it would have to wait. David's arrival meant that there were other, more immediate issues to confront. David stepped in, his smile plastered in place, though his eyes were scanning the room as if taking mental notes. His gaze flickered briefly over Grace before locking onto Michael, as though assessing just how much control he still had over the situation. "You look better than I expected, Mike," David said, approaching the bed with a casual confidence that set Michael on edge. "I guess that famous Williams resilience hasn't faded after all." Michael forced himself to sit up straighter, despite the fatigue still clinging to his body. He couldn't afford to appear weak in front of David. This was the man who had been steering the ship in his absence, the man who had more access to his company, his assets, than anyone else. "What are you doing here, David?" Michael asked, keeping his voice even but sharp. He wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. David chuckled lightly, shrugging. "I came to check on you, obviously. I've been handling things at the office, making sure everything runs smoothly while you've been indisposed." His tone was light, but there was an underlying smugness to it that made Michael's skin crawl. Indisposed. It was as though David was brushing off the gravity of Michael's situation, reducing it to a mere inconvenience. Michael clenched his jaw, feeling the frustration bubbling beneath his surface. He had always known David to be ambitious, but there was something different about him now. Something more dangerous. "How's the company?" Michael asked, cutting straight to the point. "I need an update." David's smile flickered, his eyes narrowing slightly. He hadn't expected Michael to jump into business so quickly. "The company's fine, Mike. I've been taking care of everything. Williams Innovations is in good hands, don't worry." Michael didn't believe him. There was something off about the way David spoke, as if he was hiding something. The tone of casual indifference wasn't fitting for a man running a multi-billion-dollar corporation in his partner's absence. "That's not what I asked," Michael said, his voice growing more forceful. "I want specifics. What's been happening while I've been out? Have there been any major changes?" David's smile tightened, and he glanced briefly at Grace, who was standing off to the side, her expression unreadable. He turned back to Michael, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Look, Mike, there's a lot to catch you up on, but it's nothing you need to worry about right now. You should focus on getting better." "I'll decide what I need to worry about," Michael shot back, his patience wearing thin. He was done being treated like a helpless patient. "Tell me what's been going on." David's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a hard edge that hadn't been there before. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture stiffening. "Fine," he said, his voice losing its pretense of friendliness. "Things have changed, Michael. People were nervous when you went into the coma. Investors, clients. I had to make some tough decisions to keep the company afloat." Michael felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What kind of decisions? David met his gaze, unblinking. We had to restructure, sell off a few divisions, lay off some people. It wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. The board was on edge. They wanted reassurance that the company wouldn't collapse without you. Michael's hands tightened into fists, anger boiling inside him. You sold parts of the company? He asked, his voice dangerously low. It was a strategic move, David said, lifting his chin slightly. We needed the cash flow, and the divisions we sold weren't performing well anyway. It was the right decision at the time. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. The divisions David had sold off weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They were the heart of Williams' innovations, the pieces Michael had spent years building from the ground up. To hear that they had been tossed aside like dead weight made his blood run cold. You didn't have the authority to make that call, Michael growled. You should have waited until I was awake. David's eyes darkened. Wait for what? Mike, no one knew if you were ever going to wake up. The board was on the verge of pulling the plug on the entire company. I did what I had to do to keep things going. You overstepped, Michael said, his voice shaking with anger. And you did it because you wanted control. Don't act like this was about protecting the company. David's jaw clenched, his mask of false charm slipping away entirely. I've been running that company without you for 6 months, Michael. I've made sure everything didn't fall apart. Don't stand there and pretend like you know better than me right now. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Grace stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. That's enough. Both men turned to look at her, the intensity of the argument momentarily broken. Grace's eyes were steady, her voice calm but firm. Michael, you've only just woken up. This isn't the time to get into a fight, she said, her gaze flicking from him to David. And David, you know as well as I do that this isn't the place for this conversation. Michael's anger simmered, but he forced himself to take a breath. She was right. He was pushing too hard too soon. His body was still weak, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions get the better of him right now. He needed to be smart. He needed to be strategic. David, however, wasn't done. He stepped closer to the bed, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at Michael. You might be back, Mike, but don't think for a second that you can just walk back in and take over like nothing's happened. Things have changed. People have changed. Michael held his gaze, refusing to back down. We'll see about that. The tension in the room was thick, the animosity between the two men palpable. But before things could escalate further, David took a step back, straightening his jacket and forcing a tight smile. I'll be in touch, he said, turning toward the door. We'll have that update you're so eager for soon enough. As David left, the silence that followed felt heavy, like the calm after a storm. Michael leaned back against the pillows, his mind racing. David had changed the company in ways Michael didn't yet fully understand, and the sense of betrayal was like a knife in his gut. Grace stood quietly by his side, watching him with concern. She hadn't moved since David left, but Michael could feel the weight of her unspoken thoughts. I'm sorry, she said softly, finally breaking the silence. I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to add to your stress. Michael shook his head, his eyes still on the door where David had disappeared. It's not your fault, he muttered, but I'm not letting him get away with this. Grace hesitated, then placed a hand on the edge of the bed, her voice gentle. There's more, Michael. There's more that you don't know, but we need to take this one step at a time. Michael turned to look at her, and for the first time, he saw the depth of her worry, her fear. Whatever Grace was hiding, whatever she had been holding back, was tied to something far bigger than just his company. I need to know, Grace, he said, his voice quieter now but filled with determination. I need to know everything. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something deeper, something she had been holding back for too long. All right, she whispered, but you need to prepare yourself, Michael, because once you know the truth, nothing will ever be the same. And in that moment, Michael realized that the storm brewing inside his company was only part of the battle. The real storm was yet to come, and it was tied to the woman standing beside him. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Michael lay in the hospital bed, his mind swirling with the weight of David's words and the unsettling tension between them. The company he had built, his life's work, had changed in ways he hadn't foreseen. But as heavy as that revelation was, the feeling of something far more personal brewing beneath the surface gnawed at him even more. Grace was still standing beside him, her presence steady but haunted by whatever secret she carried. He turned his head toward her, his expression resolute. "You said there was more, something I don't know. Tell me now, Grace. I can't handle any more half-truths." Grace looked down, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed as though she needed to hold onto something solid before the ground beneath her gave way. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were bracing herself for the impact of what she was about to say. "Michael," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "there's a reason I stayed by your side during the coma. It wasn't just because I was your nurse, it was because I had to." He stared at her, the words sinking in slowly, pulling his mind toward a direction he hadn't yet considered. He sat up a little more, ignoring the slight pull of pain in his muscles. "Had to," he echoed. "Why?" Grace's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw the vulnerability there, the fear of what her next words would bring. But she didn't look away. She couldn't. "Because I'm your daughter," she finally confessed, her voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. The room seemed to close in on Michael, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "Daughter?" It didn't make sense. He couldn't process it. He blinked, trying to piece together what he had just heard, but the shock left him speechless. His chest tightened as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Grace stood frozen, her hands shaking slightly as she waited for his response. She had been carrying this secret for months, and now that it was out, the silence between them felt unbearable. Michael finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "That's not possible. I don't—" He stopped himself, his mind racing through the fragments of his past. How could she be his daughter? He had never known he had one. There had been no woman, no relationship that could have led to this. At least, not one he could remember. But then, a memory flashed, distant, blurry. A woman from years ago. Someone he had cared about, but it had ended abruptly. He had buried those feelings deep, never thinking they would resurface. His heart pounded as he searched Grace's face, looking for the resemblance he had been blind to before. Her features, the sharpness of her jawline, the way her eyes held that same determined intensity he saw in his own reflection. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. How?" he stammered, still struggling to find the right words. His mind raced back to that woman, trying to connect the dots that had eluded him for so long. Grace's voice was steadier now, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "My mother. She never told you. She kept me a secret from you because she didn't want to disrupt your life. When she died, I found out everything. I found letters she had written to you but never sent. I didn't even know you were my father until she was gone." Michael's throat tightened. He had been so absorbed in his career, so obsessed with success, that parts of his personal life had slipped away, unexamined, forgotten. And now, the consequences of that neglect had come crashing down on him in the form of the daughter he never knew he had. Grace continued, her voice trembling again as the emotions spilled out. "When I found out, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to reach out, but I wasn't ready. And then I heard you had the stroke. I thought it was fate. I became your nurse because I wanted to know you. I had to know you, even if you never knew me." Michael swallowed hard, his heart aching with the enormity of what she was saying. She had been by his side, watching over him all these months, not just as a nurse, but as his daughter, and he had been too blind to see it. He reached up, rubbing a hand over his face as the realization of how much time had been lost. Time he could never get back, sank in. His mind spun, but one thought cut through the chaos. This was his fault. How could I not have known?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. "How did I miss something so important?" Grace took a step closer, her voice softer now, filled with an understanding that only deepened Michael's guilt. "You didn't know because you couldn't have known, Michael. She made that choice for you, and for me. I don't blame you for it. But Michael did blame himself. The realization that he had a daughter, that she had been living her life without him, filled him with a crushing sense of failure. All his success, all his power, none of it meant anything compared to what he had lost. A family, a connection. And the worst part was that Grace had been right in front of him all along, and he hadn't even recognized her. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice breaking. I didn't know." Grace shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I know. That's why I didn't tell you at first. I didn't want to overwhelm you while you were still recovering. But now," she paused, her hands gripping the sides of the bed, as though seeking stability in the storm of emotions between them. "Now I couldn't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know." Michael stared at her, his chest tight with regret and a deep, aching sadness. He had spent his whole life building an empire, thinking that success would fill the void in his life. But the truth was that the void had always been there. He had just been too blind to see what really mattered. And now, the weight of that blindness was almost unbearable. "Grace," he reached out, his hand trembling as he took hers. "I don't know how to make up for all this time. I don't know where to even start." She squeezed his hand, a small, sad smile pulling at her lips. "We'll figure it out. I'm not expecting us to fix everything overnight, but I didn't want to go another day without you knowing the truth. You deserve to know." Michael nodded, tears burning in his eyes. He didn't know how they were going to navigate this new reality, how they could possibly bridge the gap of all those lost years. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to lose her again. They sat there in the heavy silence, their hands intertwined, each of them caught in the tidal wave of emotions that came with the truth. The storm that had been brewing inside Michael for weeks had finally broken, and now, in the wreckage, he saw clearly what mattered. But as the weight of the revelation settled between them, Michael felt a new fear creeping in. The company, his former partner David, the enemies he hadn't even realized were circling. It was all still out there. And now, with Grace in his life, everything felt even more fragile. The stakes were higher than ever. Because now, Michael wasn't just fighting for his company, he was fighting for his family. And he had already lost too much to let anything else slip through his fingers. As the rain continued to tap against the window, Michael knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The storm wasn't over yet. The air between Michael and Grace remained thick with the weight of their revelation, but there was no time to dwell on it. As father and daughter sat in the quiet of the hospital room, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They would navigate this new reality together. But beneath that newfound connection, Michael's thoughts began to turn to darker matters: the company, David, and the unknown threats swirling around them. He had built his empire on control, but it was clear now how little of it he truly had. Michael exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm, though the anger and confusion still pulsed beneath the surface. Grace's confession had knocked him off balance, but it had also given him a sense of clarity he hadn't had in weeks. She was his daughter. There was no denying it now. And that meant protecting her, whatever it took. Grace's eyes searched his face, as if she knew what he was thinking. "There's more going on with David than you realize, isn't there?" she asked, her voice steady, though laced with concern. Michael nodded slowly. "I've had suspicions since the moment he walked into this room," he admitted. "The way he spoke about the company, he wasn't just updating me. He was claiming territory." Grace frowned, worry creasing her brow. "Do you think he's trying to take over completely? That he doesn't want you back?" "I wouldn't be surprised," Michael said, running a hand through his hair. "He's always been ambitious, but I trusted him. Now, I'm not sure what he's done behind my back while I've been lying here." The thought gnawed at him. His company had always been his greatest achievement, but now, it felt like a liability. David had been in control for 6 months, enough time to manipulate the board, shift alliances, and entrench himself in a position of power that Michael might not be able to easily reclaim. Grace stood from her chair, pacing the small space of the hospital room. "Is there anyone you trust at the company? Someone who can give you a clearer picture of what's really going on?" Michael thought for a moment, sifting through names and faces in his mind. "There's one person, Ellen. She's been with me since the beginning, one of my top executives." If anyone knows the truth, it's her. Then we need to contact her, Grace said, a sense of urgency creeping into her voice. You need to know what David's been up to before he tries to push you out completely. Michael nodded in agreement. I'll call her today. But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If David was planning something, Michael needed to act fast, before it was too late. Grace came to a stop near the window, staring out at the city beyond. Michael, she said softly, her back to him, there's something else you need to know. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Her tone was different, heavier, as if she was bracing herself for another revelation. He sat up straighter, waiting for her to continue. Grace turned to face him, her expression serious. David knows about me. He's known for a while. Michael froze, his mind reeling. What do you mean he knows? How could he? He figured it out, Grace interrupted, stepping closer to him. I don't know how, but he approached me a few weeks ago. He didn't confront me directly, but he hinted that he knew the truth. Michael's blood ran cold. If David knew about Grace, that meant his control over the situation was even weaker than he had realized. David could use this information as leverage, against Michael, against Grace, and there was no telling what kind of damage he could do with it. What did he say to you? Michael asked, his voice tight with anger. Grace hesitated, biting her lip. He asked me questions about my connection to you. He didn't come right out and say it, but it was clear he had put the pieces together. I didn't confirm anything, but I could tell he knew. Michael cursed under his breath, his fists clenching. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I didn't want to add to your stress while you were recovering, Grace said, her eyes filled with regret. And I thought I could handle it. But now, I'm not sure what David's planning. Michael's mind raced, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. David had been playing a game all along, moving pieces into place while Michael had been helpless. And now, with Grace's identity out in the open, the stakes had been raised even higher. This wasn't just about the company anymore. This was about his family. We need to get ahead of him, Michael said, his voice steely with resolve. I won't let him use you against me. We'll find out exactly what he's planning, and we'll stop him. Grace nodded, though her worry was still etched on her face. Do you think he'll try to blackmail you? Use my identity as a weapon? Michael didn't answer right away. He didn't want to scare her, but the truth was, David was capable of anything if it meant consolidating power. And if he knew about Grace, he had a powerful card to play. But Michael wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. I'll handle David, Michael said, his voice calm but firm. But we need to be smart about this. No more secrets, Grace. From now on, we face this together. Grace gave him a small, determined nod. Together. Just as Michael was about to reach for his phone to call Ellen, there was a knock at the door. Both he and Grace tensed, exchanging a glance before the door creaked open. A man in a suit stepped inside, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Mr. Williams, the man said, his voice clipped. I'm Jackson Carter, with the board at Williams Innovations. We need to speak. Michael's stomach sank. The board? This couldn't be good. He had been planning to contact Ellen for answers, but it seemed the company wasn't going to give him the time. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. He straightened up, trying to mask the unease creeping up his spine. What's this about? Michael asked, keeping his tone measured. Jackson stepped further into the room, his gaze briefly flickering toward Grace before settling back on Michael. There's been some discussion among the board members. We're concerned about the stability of the company with everything that's happened, and we've been talking to David about a plan for the future. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't like where this was going. Not at all. A plan for the future? Michael repeated, his voice hardening. And what exactly does that entail? Jackson cleared his throat, shifting slightly. We've decided to hold a meeting to vote on the leadership of the company moving forward. Given the uncertainty surrounding your health, the board believes it's time to explore new leadership. Michael's blood boiled. This was it. David had been orchestrating this from the start, manipulating the board to push Michael out of his own company. And let me guess, Michael said, his voice laced with anger. David's the one they're pushing to replace me. Jackson didn't confirm it outright, but the look on his face said enough. Michael clenched his jaw, the rage bubbling beneath the surface. This was exactly what he had feared. David had been working behind the scenes, pulling strings, and now he was on the verge of taking everything. "You should attend the meeting," Jackson said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's scheduled for tomorrow morning." Michael nodded stiffly, his mind already working through the next steps. He couldn't lose the company, not like this. But more than that, he couldn't let David gain any more control. Not with Grace's identity hanging in the balance. "I'll be there," Michael said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Jackson gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But before he stepped out, he glanced at Grace one more time, his eyes narrowing slightly as if sensing something he couldn't quite place. Then he was gone, leaving Michael and Grace alone once again. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, dialing Ellen's number with a newfound urgency. He needed allies now more than ever. And tomorrow, at that board meeting, he would need every bit of strength he had left. But as he waited for Ellen to pick up, one thought haunted him. If David knew about Grace, he wouldn't stop at taking the company. He would go after everything that mattered to Michael. And now, Michael was fighting for more than just a business. He was fighting for his daughter. Michael sat in the hospital room, his phone pressed to his ear as the line rang. Each passing second felt like a hammer pounding against his chest. He needed to reach Ellen before the situation spiraled further out of control. Grace watched him from across the room, her eyes reflecting the same anxiety that tightened his throat. Finally, Ellen's voice broke through the tension. "Michael, is that really you?" Michael exhaled in relief, gripping the phone tighter. "Yeah, Ellen, it's me. I need your help." Her sigh echoed through the line. "God, I've been worried about you. I heard you woke up, but David's been. Let's just say he's been keeping things close to the vest." "That's exactly why I'm calling," Michael said, leaning forward. "He's setting up a board meeting to vote on my replacement. I need to know what he's been doing behind my back." Ellen didn't hesitate. "He's been making moves for months, Michael. It started slow, restructuring, as he called it. But then, he started meeting privately with key board members, selling the idea that the company needed new leadership. He's painted you as unstable, unfit to lead." Michael's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed left a bitter taste in his mouth. "And the board bought it?" "Some did," Ellen admitted, her voice laced with frustration. "But not everyone. I've done what I can to keep people loyal to you. But David's been pushing hard. He's promising quick profits, bigger dividends. People are getting greedy." Of course they were. Michael could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. He had built this company with integrity, always playing the long game. But now, David was dangling short-term gains in front of the board, tempting them to throw loyalty out the window. "What's the endgame here, Ellen?" Michael asked, his voice tight. "Does he want complete control, or is he just trying to squeeze me out?" There was a pause on the other end, and Michael could almost hear the hesitation in Ellen's breath. "It's worse than that," she said quietly. "He's been negotiating with a private equity firm, selling off parts of the company to them piece by piece. If he succeeds, there won't be a company left for you to come back to." Michael's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a hostile takeover. David was dismantling everything, taking apart the empire brick by brick while Michael had been lying in a coma. He was trying to erase Michael from the company's history entirely. "Why didn't you stop him?" Michael demanded, his voice rising with desperation. "I tried," Ellen said, her voice tight with regret, "but he kept me in the dark for too long. By the time I realized what he was doing, he already had the backing of key players. He's got the board on his side for the vote tomorrow." Michael's mind raced. He felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in around him. David had outmaneuvered him at every turn, and now, the final blow was coming. But Michael wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "There has to be a way to stop him," Michael said, more to himself than to Ellen. "There has to be something we can do." "There might be one thing," Ellen said, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "David's been keeping secrets, too. He's made deals under the table. Deals that would ruin his credibility if they came to light. If we can expose him before the vote, we might have a shot at turning the tide." Michael's pulse quickened. This was his chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. He had to find a way to get the dirt on David and present it to the board before the vote. But he needed more time. "Do you have proof?" Michael asked, hope flickering in his chest. "Not yet," Ellen admitted, "but I'm working on it. I've got a few leads, but I'll need to dig deeper." "Do whatever it takes," Michael said, his voice hardening. "I'll be at that meeting tomorrow, and I'm not walking in unarmed." Ellen paused, her tone softening. "You've got a tough fight ahead, Michael, but I'm with you." Michael hung up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He didn't have much time, but he couldn't sit back and let David destroy everything he'd built. He had to act now, before it was too late. Grace stepped forward, her eyes filled with concern. What did she say? Michael rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "David's been selling off the company to a private equity firm. If I don't stop him, there won't be anything left." Grace's face paled. "How can he do that?" "He's been working behind the scenes for months," Michael explained, his voice tight. "But there's a chance we can expose him." Ellen's looking for proof. Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "We can't let him get away with this, Michael. He's already taken so much from you." Michael nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know, and now he's coming after you, too." The fear in Grace's eyes deepened. "Do you really think he'll use me against you?" "I don't know," Michael admitted, his voice low. "But if he knows you're my daughter, he might see you as a threat. He'll do whatever it takes to secure his position." Grace stepped closer, her voice filled with determination. "Then we fight back. Whatever it takes, we fight." Michael met her gaze, a fierce sense of protectiveness surging through him. Grace had become more than just his daughter. She was his ally in this battle, someone he would protect at all costs. The next morning came too quickly. The tension in the air was palpable as Michael prepared to leave the hospital and head to the board meeting. His body still felt weak, but his mind was sharp, focused. He was ready to face David and reclaim what was his. Grace stood by his side as they walked into the boardroom, her presence a source of strength he hadn't known he needed. The room was filled with familiar faces, board members he had known for years, their expressions carefully neutral as they watched him enter. And there, at the head of the table, sat David, his smile cool and calculated. "Michael," David said, standing to greet him, "I wasn't sure you'd make it." Michael forced a smile, though the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." David gestured to the chair across from him. "Let's get started, shall we?" As Michael sat down, he could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. This was it, the moment everything came to a head. The board members exchanged glances before one of them, a man named Roger, cleared his throat. "We've gathered today to discuss the future of Williams Innovations," Roger began. "Given recent events, the board has decided to vote on whether new leadership is needed." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment David had been working toward, the moment he would try to push Michael out for good. Before Roger could continue, Michael spoke up. "Before we vote, there's something you all need to know about David." David's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Michael met his gaze, unflinching. "David has been selling off pieces of this company behind your backs. He's been negotiating with a private equity firm, making deals that would dismantle everything we've built." The room erupted into murmurs, the board members exchanging shocked glances. David's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he tried to regain control of the situation. "That's absurd," David said, his voice cold. "I've done everything to protect this company while you were incapacitated." Michael stood, his voice rising with conviction. "You haven't been protecting anything. You've been tearing it apart, and I have proof." Just as he finished speaking, the door opened and Ellen walked in, holding a folder filled with documents. She gave Michael a nod before handing the papers to the board members. "These are the deals David has been making," Ellen said, her voice steady. "He's been selling off assets, making promises to outside investors. If we don't stop him now, Williams Innovations will be nothing but a memory." The room fell into stunned silence as the board members pored over the documents, their faces filled with disbelief. Michael could see the tide turning. This was his moment. David's expression twisted into one of anger and desperation. This is a smear campaign. You're all being manipulated. But the damage was done. The board members were already murmuring among themselves, their trust in David crumbling with each passing second. "We need to vote," Roger said, his voice firm. "Now." Michael sat back down, his heart racing. This was it, the culmination of everything. As the votes were cast, Michael kept his gaze locked on David, who was now visibly sweating. When the final vote was tallied, Roger stood. "The board has decided. David, you're out." A stunned silence followed the declaration. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this wasn't the end. David wasn't finished, not yet. As David rose from his chair, his eyes burning with rage, he leaned in close to Michael. "This isn't over, Williams. Not by a long shot." Michael met his gaze, unflinching. "We'll see about that." With David out of the picture, Michael had won the battle. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. The boardroom emptied quickly, but the tension lingered in the air. Michael stood by the window, watching as David stormed out, his shoulders stiff with fury. The vote had been decisive. David was out, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing beneath the surface. This victory had come too easily. Grace stood beside him, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "It's over, right?" she asked, her voice soft, as though afraid to hope. Michael glanced at her, feeling the weight of her question. "For now," he said quietly, his eyes returning to the city skyline. "But David won't go down without a fight. He's lost control of the company, but he still knows too much. And if he's desperate enough, he'll come after us in other ways." Grace's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "Do you think he'll try to use your identity against me?" "Absolutely," Michael finished, his voice steely. "David's always been 2 steps ahead. Now that he's out, he's going to look for any weakness he can exploit. And that means you." Grace paled, her hands trembling. "I didn't want this. I didn't mean to make things harder for you." Michael turned to face her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This isn't your fault, Grace. I've made my share of mistakes, and one of them was trusting David for so long. But I'm not going to let him hurt you. Not after everything." Grace nodded, but Michael could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty of what was to come. He felt it too, a gnawing tension in the pit of his stomach. He had won the battle for the company, but there were still too many loose ends, too many dangers lurking in the shadows. As the day stretched on, Michael made calls, rallying support from the remaining board members, tightening the company's defenses, and preparing for whatever David might throw at him next. But there was a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't go away. This fight was personal now, and Michael knew that David was capable of anything. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael sat in his office, staring at the glowing city lights outside. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he hesitated before picking it up. "Michael," Ellen's voice came through the line, low and urgent. "I've been digging into David's connections. You need to be careful. He's made some dangerous allies." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "David's been working with people outside the company," Ellen continued. "Powerful people. If he can't take you down legally, he'll do it by any means necessary." Michael's pulse quickened. The war wasn't over. David was coming for him, and for Grace. The next few days passed in a blur of tension. Michael barely slept, his mind racing as he tried to stay ahead of David's next move. Every time the phone rang, he braced for bad news. Ellen's warning about David's dangerous allies echoed in his thoughts, but he wasn't just fighting for the company anymore. He was fighting to protect Grace. Late one night, the phone finally rang with the call he'd been dreading. Michael answered, his voice steady despite the dread crawling up his spine. "We have a problem," Ellen said, her tone grim. "David's gone off the grid, but I've tracked his movements. He's been in contact with a man named Victor Hawthorne, ex-CEO, ruthless, blacklisted from the industry for dirty dealings. He's not just looking to take you down, Michael. He's looking to destroy you." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "What's their plan?" "They've been setting up a smear campaign," Ellen replied, "leaking false information about your health and business practices. It's going to hit the press any day now. And if that's not enough, they'll come after Grace. They know she's your daughter. Michael's stomach twisted. David was playing his last card, willing to burn everything down if it meant taking Michael with him. I won't let that happen, Michael said, determination sharpening his voice. We need to get ahead of this. But the clock was ticking, and Michael knew they had to act fast. He reached out to his PR team, strategizing a counterattack. Every asset, every connection he had built over the years would be used to defend not just his name, but Grace's future. There was no room for error. The following morning, the first news reports hit. Headlines speculating about Michael's health and his fitness to lead Williams' innovations flooded the media. The smear campaign was in full swing, and David was nowhere to be found. But Michael was ready. He held a press conference, standing tall beside Grace as he addressed the rumors head-on. The lies stop here, he declared, his voice steady as cameras flashed. I'm not just fighting for this company. I'm fighting for my family. The strategy worked. The tide began to turn. Support poured in from investors and allies who refused to let David's narrative take hold. Michael's transparency, combined with Grace's quiet strength at his side, won them back. By the end of the week, David's smear campaign had crumbled under the weight of truth, and Victor Hawthorne's reputation took the hit instead. David was finished, his last desperate attempt to destroy Michael collapsing in front of him. As the dust settled, Michael knew the war was over. He turned to Grace, pulling her into a tight embrace. We made it, he whispered, the relief overwhelming them both. For the first time in months, Michael felt a sense of peace. He hadn't just saved his company, he'd found his daughter. And together, they were unstoppable. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.